The 26th Regiment of Foot was a Scottish infantry regiment of the British Army, active from 1689 to 1881. Although the regiment took the name of its first colonel as the Earl of Angus's regiment, it became popularly known as the Cameronians until 1751, when it was ranked as the 26th Foot. In 1881, it merged with the 90th Regiment of Foot to form the Cameronians. The Cameronians were themselves disbanded in 1968, meaning that no army unit today perpetuates the lineage of the 26th Foot formation. It was originally raised as the Cameronian Guard by the Lords of the Convention, named after the Cameronians, followers of the Presbyterian Richard Cameron, who had been a militant leader in the struggles of the Covenanters against attempts by the Stuart monarchs Charles II and James VII to outlaw Presbyterianism and impose bishops on the Church of Scotland. This conflict culminated with the Glorious Revolution, leading to a convention of the Estates of Scotland meeting on the 14th of March 1689. On the 11th of April, the day of the English coronation, the convention finally declared that James was no longer King of Scotland, and offered the crown jointly to William and Mary. In March 1689, 3 Scottish regiments in the service of William arrived in Edinburgh, and the ad hoc forces raised to protect the convention were dismissed. However, the following month, a regiment was raised near Douglas by James, Earl of Angus, drawn from among the Cameronians, and placed under the service of William II. 1,200 men are said to have been enlisted in a single day, without the need for the beat of drum, or any bounty money being paid. The regiment had a nominal strength of 1,200 men, in 20 companies of 60, and its unusual religious background was reflected in the regulation that each company was to have an elder, as well as the regimental chaplain being a Cameronian. Service under William III. It entered government service under King William II of Scotland, III of England, in 1689, and on the 21st of August defeated Dundee's Jacobite forces at the Battle of Dunkeld, a turning point in Dundee's Jacobite rising of that year. Dundee's insurrection, Dunkeld, War of the League of Augsburg, Landon. After the Treaty of Ryswick was signed in September 1697, Parliament responded to political unrest over the concept of a large standing army by voting to disband all the forces raised since 1680, and to support only a minimal force of 10,000 men. William responded to this by taking a number of regiments, including the Cameronians, onto the strength of the Dutch establishment, where they would not need to be supported by Parliament. They were returned to the English establishment in 1700. War of the Spanish Succession. On the outbreak of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1701, an English expeditionary force of 13 regiments was sent to the Netherlands. A second force followed in early 1702, which included the Cameronians, and both groups joined a large Allied army under the command of the Duke of Marlborough when war was declared in May. Through 1702 and 1703 the army took a number of towns by siege, though the Cameronians' participation is not recorded in any of these events. They were, however, to be fully engaged the following year. They assembled for the 1704 campaign at Bedburg in the middle of May, and in early July detachment was part of the main British attack at the Battle of Skellenburg. Of the 130 men involved, 19 were killed and 62 wounded. The regiment then fought at the Battle of Blenheim in July, where it saw additional duty the following night guarding some of the 13,000 men taken prisoner. The British force was withdrawn to the Netherlands in October, where it went into winter quarters. In In 1705, they fought at the Battle of Elixheim, though the rest of the year's campaign was mostly uneventful. On General Ferguson's death, the colonelcy of the regiment passed to John Borthwick, the lieutenant colonel, in October. However, Borthwick chose to exchange his colonelcy for that of a Dutch regiment under Lord John Dalrymple, who became the regiment's colonel as of 1 January 1706. The Cameronians left winter quarters at the end of April 1706, and during May participated in the extensive manoeuvring which led to the Battle of Ramillies on the 23rd. The regiment did not take part in the main attack, but were exposed to heavy cannon fire during the battle, and took a large number of casualties. In August, the colonel, now the Earl of Stair, was appointed to command the Scots Greys, and the lieutenant colonel, George Preston, succeeded him in the colonelcy. The regiment fought at a number of sieges during the later part of the year, including at A, where a party of Cameronians managed to break into the fortress walls 4 days before it surrendered. The 1707 campaign was uneventful, but the regiment suffered extensively from fatigue and illness, being reduced at one point to 100 men able to fight. In 1708 the regiment was briefly placed on notice to return to Great Britain, which was threatened with invasion, but was stood down after the French fleet was dispersed without making a landing. In July they fought at the Battle of Oudenarde, taking heavy casualties, and then served at the Siege of Lille. During the siege, they were part of a force detached to guard an ammunition convoy. In late September, it was intercepted by a French force at Vinumdale, who were themselves successfully ambushed by the escorts. The French force lost 6,000 killed and wounded, compared to only 900 of the Allied force. At the very end of the year, the Cameronians were part of the force which captured Ghent, where they then remained in winter quarters. They left Ghent in June 1709, and were part of the covering force during the siege of Tournai. When the town was captured in early September, the main army moved south. The French army encountered them just outside Mons, and they skirmished briefly with artillery fire on the 9th. In this engagement, the Cameronians took heavy losses, being in an exposed section of the battle line. The Battle of Malplaquet itself took place on the 11th, with the Cameronians in the central British infantry line. This force repeatedly beat off a French cavalry attack, and was credited by the French commander as a major element in his defeat. The regiment's losses included its lieutenant colonel, who was shot whilst riding at the head of his men. In the first part of 1710, the regiment was part of the force besieging Douai. They repelled a counter-attack in May with no casualties. However, they regularly took small losses in minor skirmishes, and eventually lost a total of 51 men killed and 192 wounded in the siege. After the surrender of Douai, they covered a siege at Bethune before returning to winter quarters in Ghent. They left Ghent unusually early the next year, in late March, and moved quickly into French territory to hold an advanced position before falling back in April to join the main force as it assembled. Throughout the summer they followed Marlborough through northern France, and were a part of the attacking army at the siege of Bouchon in August, before returning to winter quarters. After some inconclusive fighting in 1712, they withdrew to garrison Dunkirk. After the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the fortifications here were demolished and the garrison moved to Nieuwpoort in May. They returned to Dunkirk in August, and there embarked for Wyland. During the campaign, Blackadder recorded that the Cameronians had been thanked by Marlborough 7 times for their conduct in action. The 26th was later authorized to carry the battle honours Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, and Malplaquet, for its 4 most prominent engagements in the war. However, these were not authorized until 1882, a year after the regiment had been amalgamated into the Cameronians. Mid-18th century service, 1715 to 1767. The Cameronians were transferred from the posting in Ireland to Scotland in late 1715, ordered there to fight against the First Jacobite Rising. The regiment were moved to Preston in November 1715, along with 6 regiments of cavalry, where they found a strong Jacobite force in possession of the town. A frontal attack into the town on the 12th of November, led by the Cameronians as the only infantry force present, was beaten back with heavy losses. A further 3 regiments arrived the next day, and the Jacobite force, now surrounded, surrendered unconditionally. The regiment took 92 casualties in the Battle of Preston, including 3 of its senior officers who were wounded. Following the suppression of the rebellion, the Cameronians returned to Ireland in 1716. Philip Anstruther was promoted colonel of the regiment in May 1720. In 1726, they left Ireland to serve as Marines aboard naval ships, and were then sent as reinforcements to the garrison at Gibraltar during the war with Spain in 1727. They did not see field combat during the siege of Gibraltar, as the activity on both sides was mostly a matter of long-distance bombardment rather than direct attacks. 9 men were killed or died of wounds, and 29 were injured. The Cameronians remained in the Gibraltar garrison until 1738, when they moved to Minorca and left the foreisland in 1748. On the 1st of July 1751, the regiment was formally ranked as the 26th Regiment of Foot, and issued with new, standardized, regimental colours. The regiment returned to Scotland in 1754, and then moved back to Ireland in 1757, where they remained for the following decade. In 1760, Colonel Edward Sandford was appointed colonel, and replaced in 1763 by Colonel John Scott. North American service, 1767 to 1800, and the American War of Independence. The regiment embarked for the North American colonies in 1767 to take up garrison duties. On the outbreak of hostilities in the American War of Independence in 1775, the 26th Foot were stationed in Lower Canada along with the 7th Royal Fusiliers. The 2 regiments were loosely scattered among frontier posts, and both were at a very low strength, mustering around 700 men between them. On the 10th of May, 36 soldiers and 2 officers of the 26th were captured at Fort Ticonderoga by force led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. A second detachment at Fort Crown Point was taken without incident the next day, and the main force of the 7th and 26th Regiments withdrew towards Fort St. Jean in Quebec. An expedition by 150 men under Allen to capture Montreal was defeated on the 25th of September by 36 Cameronians, the entire regular garrison of the city, and a local militia force. The Americans, under General Richard Montgomery, had meanwhile led a strong force against St. Jean, and began to besiege the fortress in September. The garrison, commanded by Major Charles Preston of the 26th, was made up of 550 men from the 7th and 26th. However, supplies of food and ammunition were limited, and the defenders were forced to surrender in early November. The American force moved towards Montreal, which was evacuated, with the garrison, containing the remnants of the 26th, falling back towards Quebec. They were overtaken en route along the St. Lawrence, and taken prisoner. The regimental colors were abandoned in the river in order that they would not be captured. This effectively ended the 26th's participation in the fighting for Canada, though a few stragglers may have served with the defenders at the Battle of Quebec in December. A group of reinforcements being sent out to the regiment was landed in May 1776, with the force which lifted the siege of the city. After a large force of Americans was captured at the Battle of the Cedars, they were exchanged for prisoners from the 7th and 26th. Allowing these regiments to reform in the summer. The 26th was moved to the New York Theater in the autumn, and camped at Amboy, New Jersey throughout the winter. It made a short raid further into New Jersey, towards Newark, in September 1777, and then moved to Staten Island. The regiment participated in the attack on Fort Clinton on the 6th of October, along with 3 other regiments. The fort was taken with few casualties, but this did not lead to any lasting strategic advantage. The regiment remained at Staten Island through the Philadelphia campaign, and in late 1779 were ordered home. The rank and file of the regiment were transferred into other units, and the regimental staff returned to England to raise a new force. On arriving in England, they were sent to Staffordshire, and by the end of 1780 had a strength of 200 men. It moved to Shrewsbury in 1781, growing to a strength of 336 men by the end of the year, and then moved to Scotland via Tynemouth. It remained in Scotland until October 1783, when it moved to Ireland. Lieutenant General Sir William Erskine was appointed colonel of the regiment in 1782, and petitioned the king for the right to officially change the regimental name. The traditional title of Cameronian had fallen into disuse at some point during the 18th century, and Erskine felt that it should be restored. Accordingly, in February 1786, the regiment was formally permitted to assume the title Cameronian. The regiment embarked from Cork in May 1787, with a full establishment strength of around 350 men, and arrived in British North America in August. They were garrisoned around Quebec, moving to Montreal in 1789, and then to the frontier posts along the Niagara River in 1790. It moved to St. John in 1792, and then returned to Montreal in 1794. In March 1795, Major General Sir Charles Stewart was appointed the regimental colonel. The regiment moved back and forth between Montreal and Quebec over the following years, absorbing a large draft of men from the 4th Foot in 1797 in order to bring it up to the new strength of 10 companies. In May 1800, the regiment moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where it served in garrison duties for 4 months before sailing for England in September. On the return, however, one of the 3 transport ships was captured by a French privateer, the Grand Décidé, with the men paroled and allowed to return to England on the promise that they would not serve until exchanged for French prisoners. In March 1801, Lieutenant General Andrew Gordon was appointed colonel of the regiment. Egypt, 1801 to 1802. The regiment was ordered to sail for Egypt in May 1801, to reinforce the British Army fighting in the Egyptian campaign. It arrived in mid-July, joining the force under General Hely Hutchinson, and served during the siege of Alexandria. The regiment embarked for England in late October, with a large number of its men suffering from ophthalmia contracted in Egypt. The regiment was granted permission to carry the battle honour Egypt on its colours, along with an image of the Sphinx, and 25 of its officers were awarded gold medals by Sultan Selim III. The regiment returned to England in February 1802, about a month before the Treaty of Amiens was signed, ending the war with France. On their arrival, a large number of men were discharged due to incapacity or due to the term terms of service having expired, and after some ineffective recruiting attempts moved to Scotland in November. However, the recruiting here was equally limited, with the regiment having to send recruiting parties as far afield as Ireland for men. Napoleonic Wars. When hostilities resumed with France in May 1803, the Cameronians were based at Fort George, in the Highlands of Scotland. They were brought south to Stirling at the end of July, where they were heavily reinforced from men who had been recruited under the Army of Reserve Act. Over 1,300 new men were enlisted, and the regiment was able to raise a second battalion, both having about equal proportions of new and old recruits. The 1st Battalion moved to Ulster in December, with the 2nd following later in the month. In August 1804 they both moved to the Curragh, where they took part in large-scale manoeuvres for 2 months before returning to winter quarters. In December the battalions were reorganized, with the 1st Battalion taking all the men on regular enlistments who were liable for foreign service, and any reserve men who had volunteered to be sent overseas, and transferring all the reserve men who were only liable for home service to the 2nd Battalion. This left the 1st Battalion with 600 men, whilst the 2nd Battalion had almost twice that strength. 1st Battalion. The regiment moved to Germany in 1805, then returned to home service. It then was shipped to Spain in 1809 for service in the Peninsular War, where it fought at the Battle of Corunna, and then to the Netherlands for the Walcheren campaign. It returned to Spain in 1811, and then took up garrison duties in Gibraltar until the end of the war. 1st Peninsula, Corunna, Flanders 1809, Walcheren 2nd Battalion. A 2nd Battalion was raised in 1804 and served in the United Kingdom. It was disbanded in Scotland in 1813, having not seen active service. Irish service 1822 to 1827. The Cameronians were originally ordered to return from Gibraltar in May 1821, but this order was countermanded, and it was not until November 1822 that the regiment was finally transferred to its new posting in Fermoy, County Cork, moving into Cork proper in April 1823. Here, they garrisoned the city, and patrolled the local roads at night. However, the regiment's discipline suffered heavily from the move. In Gibraltar, they had had little interaction with the Spanish-speaking local population, whilst here they could freely socialize in the town. As a result, the rate of drunkenness, and associated minor infractions, increased sharply. In January 1824 the regiment moved to Kinsale, with detachments in a number of scattered outposts, and then in October to Tralee, again the central point of a number of smaller garrisons. It was expanded from 8 to 10 companies in March 1825, moving to scattered stations around Naas, County Kildare in October. In 1826 the regiment was ordered to embark for England at short notice in response to extensive rioting in Lancashire, though they returned to Ireland shortly afterwards and took up a garrison posting in the Royal Barracks, Dublin. The time in Kildare, and to a greater degree in Dublin, was marked by a sharp increase in the rate of desertion. 42 men deserted in 1826–27, as against 37 in the previous 8 years. The regiment moved to Richmond Barracks in January 1827, and in July left Dublin for various postings around Waterford. They were ordered to England late in the year to prepare for colonial service, arriving in Chatham in November, where older men were discharged. India 1828–1840. The 26th was not embarked for India until May 1828, arriving in Fort St. George, Madras in September. This was the first time the regiment had seen service in India. It took on a draft of men from the 30th Regiment of Foot in November, and settled into a peaceful and mostly healthy period as part of the city's garrison. The regiment was ordered to Calcutta in July 1830, though plans were made for some months to send them to Bangalore instead. On their arrival they moved north to Chinchura, and were then ordered to march to Karnal, in northwestern India. They departed Chinchura in December, having lost 13 men to cholera, and after a long and complicated march arrived at Meerut at the end of March 1831. They had marched 900 miles over 80 days, some days making less than 3 miles. The subsequent years were again passed in quiet garrison duties, losing around 20 men a year to disease. On the 21st of August 1834, the regiment was ordered to prepare for active service immediately, as a result of a dispute with the local prince, and after some delays marched for Marwar on the 1st of October. However, it was halted 10 days later by the news that the Raja of Jodhpur had reached a peaceful agreement with the British and that troops were no longer needed. At the start of 1836 the regiment was relieved at Meerut by the 3rd Buffs, and moved southeast to Ghazipur. It remained here less than a year, or ordered to proceed to Calcutta at the beginning of December. This march proved much easier than the opposite journey 6 years previously, and the regiment arrived at Fort William in good order on the 17th of January 1838. It remained there in garrison through 1838 and 1839, but in 1840 received orders to prepare for overseas service. China, 1840 to 1842. The regiment embarked at Calcutta on the 24th of March 1840 with a strength of 900 men, bound for Singapore, where it would rendezvous with an expeditionary force being prepared for service in China. The force arrived off Chasan on the 4th of July, capturing it with little resistance the following day. The 26th was camped on a hill just inside the city, where heavy work, bad terrain and bad provisions soon caused illness to set in. The regiment moved into the city proper in September, by which time 400 men were sick, and in October and November around 80 men died each month. 260 men were evacuated to Manila in November, and by the end of the year 240 men had died, with 163 sick in Chasan and a mere 110 able-bodied men. All available able-bodied men were moved north to support the attack on the Berg forts, which fell on the 7th of January 1841 in the Second Battle of Chuenpi, after an abortive attempt at a treaty agreement had fallen through. The regiment participated in the second attack to capture them on the 26th of February in the Battle of the Berg. The force slowly moved upriver, taking Canton on the 24th of May, and with the 26th beating off a Chinese counter-attack on the 30th of May, before withdrawing to Hong Kong after another provisional treaty was signed. Whilst resting at Hong Kong, the 26th made an expedition against Amoy in August, before being moved up the coast to Ningbo at the end of December aboard HMS Jupiter, equipped with newly modified percussion muskets. They arrived at Ningbo on the 7th of February 1842, and took up garrison there. The town was attacked on the night of 9 to 10 March, though the 26th were not involved in the defense, and a few days later participated in an expedition to attack 2 fortified camps nearby. In early May Ningbo was evacuated, and the 26th moved northwards again to support an attack on Chapu. Here, the 26th saw heavy fighting, with 3 men killed before the town was taken. The regiment then moved with the main force up the Yangtze towards Shanghai and Nanking, with the 26th part of the force which stormed Zhenjiang on the 21st of July. They disembarked outside Nanking on the 11th of August, remaining there whilst the Treaty of Nanking was signed, and then withdrew, reaching Hong Kong on the 30th of October. The regiment was granted permission to carry the battle honour China on its colours, along with an image of a dragon. As a result of its services during this expedition,